The Crusades are one of the most misunderstood episodes in European history. People are generally confused about them at every level. Their origin, their purpose, the details of their campaigns, their consequences, and their legacy. Even today, the subject provokes considerable controversy. Some view the Crusades as horrific religious wars, a kind of Catholic jihad that is a shameful stain on the pages of Christian history. For others, the Crusades were a glorious epoch, calling to mind a time when faith was capable of motivating men to undertake the most daring adventures in pursuit of noble ideals. It is certainly beyond the scope of this video to settle all these questions definitively, but what we can do is shed some light on the background of the Crusades to help us better understand them in their historical context. In this video, we will therefore attempt to answer one simple question. Why did the Crusades happen? This objective will require us to focus on the events leading up to the First Crusade in particular, which lasted from 1096 to 1099. It will also require us to get acquainted with the situation in the Mediterranean world in the centuries between the fall of the Roman Empire and the outbreak of the Crusades. So then, let's dive right in. In ancient times, the entire Mediterranean world and much of Western Europe was united under the Roman Empire. Stretching from Scotland to Iraq, and from Romania to the borders of Sudan and Morocco, Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East shared a common culture bequeathed to them by Rome. But by the end of the 3rd century, it was becoming increasingly difficult for Rome to hold its empire together. Civil wars, economic problems, and invasions by Germanic barbarians stressed the empire's resources almost to the limit. Around the year 293 AD, the Emperor Diocletian split the Roman Empire in half to make it easier to govern. Constantine reunited the empire in 324, but this proved a short-term solution, and the empire was split again by Emperor Theodosius in 395, this time permanently. Two important points. First, by this time the most important city in Europe was no longer Rome, but Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the political and religious center from which the Eastern Empire was governed. Second, by this time the Roman Empire had become Christian. Christianity was first legalized by Constantine in 313, and later made the official religion of the empire in 380 by Theodosius. Thus, by the end of the 4th century, we have a single culture, at once Roman and Christian, divided into two political units, an Eastern and Western Roman Empire. The Western Empire did not survive much longer. Germanic barbarians broke off pieces of the Western Empire, turning them into their own kingdoms. The last emperor of the West was deposed in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, lived on and flourished, surviving for almost 1,000 years, and became known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire continued to rule the East for another century and a half. Constantinople was the capital of the East, with Christians from Egypt to Armenia looking to Constantinople for political and spiritual leadership. Jerusalem, too, was of immense importance as a religious center. By the 6th century, tens of thousands of Christian pilgrims descended on Jerusalem every year to venerate the sites associated with the life of Jesus Christ. This was especially true during Lent and Easter, when the lavish Triduum liturgies at the Holy Sepulchre, the burial place of Christ, were the focal point of the Christian world. The Middle East was a Christian region. But during the early 7th century, a long war against the Persians exhausted the wealth and manpower of the Byzantine Empire. They were thus not prepared when, in 634, a new threat emerged from the Arabs, swarming out of the Arabian Peninsula inflamed with zeal for the new religion of Muhammad. The Muslim Arabs swept over Syria and the Holy Land, detaching it from the Byzantine Empire in 638. By 642, Christian Egypt too had fallen, and the Muslims were pushing into Asia Minor. Even the city of Constantinople itself was attacked in 717. The Byzantines repelled the attack on their capital and stabilized what remained of their empire, but not before the Muslims had managed to wrestle almost 50% of their territory away from them. From the 7th century onward, there were now two Christian worlds in the East: the free Christians who remained under Byzantine control, and the millions who lived under Muslim rule under the Caliphate, the Islamic Empire. Here they were considered dhimmi, that is, second-class citizens, subject to extra taxes and restrictions on their freedom and expression of religion. Muslims sought to remake the Middle East from a Christian culture into an Islamic society. Over time, the Holy Land would be governed by different Islamic dynasties. From 750 until 1071, the Holy Land was ruled by the Abbasid dynasty from their capital in Baghdad. Though the Abbasids encouraged conversion to Islam and levied the jizya tax on non-Muslims, Christians were generally allowed to practice their religion freely, so long as they weren't too public about it. The Abbasids had good reason to leave Christians in relative peace. Every year, thousands of Christian pilgrims from around the world continued to come to the Holy Land to venerate the sacred places. The pilgrimage traffic was big business. Pilgrims paid tolls to use the Abbasids' roads and bridges. They bought supplies from Abbasid merchants and spent money at Abbasid establishments. In other words, Christian pilgrimage was big business for the Abbasids, a kind of medieval tourism industry. Thus, both sides got what they wanted. Christians had access to the holy places, and their money flowed into Abbasid coffers. This changed in the 11th century, however, with the coming of the Seljuks. The Seljuks were a Turkic people from the steppes of Asia. Migrating into the Middle East in the 10th and 11th centuries, they converted to Islam and began to challenge the power of the Abbasids. Throughout the 11th century, the Seljuks increasingly chipped away at the Abbasids' domain. This eventually brought them into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, whose rule extended as far as Armenia and the borders of Syria. In 1064, the Seljuks overran the Byzantine territory of Iberia and captured several fortresses, including the strategically important Castle of Manzikert on the Armenian border. Now, the Byzantine emperor at this time was Romanus Diogenes. Though he had not ruled long, Romanus came from a distinguished line of Byzantine aristocrats and had considerable military experience. Romanus believed it was essential to recapture these lost fortresses and mobilized a Byzantine army to take them back in 1071. Emperor Romanus believed the time was ideal, as the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan was away on a campaign in Egypt. Romanus hoped to sweep through the eastern provinces while the Seljuks were away, reclaiming the lost fortresses of Iberia. Unbeknownst to Romanus, however, Alp Arslan was not away on campaign in Egypt. In fact, he was nearby with his entire army, some 30,000 cavalry plus allies. Alp Arslan knew exactly where Romanus was, while Romanus was completely unaware of his opponent's location. Romanus made the mistake of splitting his army in two, reducing his forces by half. Soon, the Seljuks were sighted, and Romanus realized that Alp Arslan was nearby. Thousands of soldiers began to desert from Romanus's poorly disciplined army. They had marched east, thinking to easily conquer poorly defended lands. They were simply not prepared for a massive encounter with the full might of the Seljuk army. Romanus's reduced, divided, and disorganized army engaged the Seljuks on August 26, 1071, near Manzikert. The resulting conquest was a complete rout for the Byzantines. The core of the Byzantine army was destroyed. Emperor Romanus was wounded and taken prisoner. When Romanus was brought before Alp Arslan, the Sultan at first refused to believe that this bloodied prisoner was actually the Byzantine emperor. After discovering his identity, he placed his boot on Romanus's neck and forced him to kiss the ground as a sign of submission. After forcing Romanus to agree to humiliating territorial concessions and a massive ransom, the emperor was released and allowed to return home. Romanus's escape was short-lived, however. The disaster at Manzikert had weakened Romanus's political standing at home. He was soon overthrown, blinded, and died from his wounds. After 1071, the Seljuks took control of the lucrative pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. Whereas the Abbasids had been content to let Christian pilgrimage continue, the Seljuks were much more hostile. Pilgrims were attacked and plundered, sometimes killed, and often captured and sold into slavery. The once constant flow of pilgrims slowed to a trickle. For the first time in centuries, Christians outside the Holy Land were unable to safely access the places of Christ's life. The years after Manzikert were chaotic for the Byzantines, leading to the rise of a new imperial family, the Komneni, under the emperor Alexios Komnenos. Alexios was eager to push the Seljuks back out of Asia Minor and re-establish control of the pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land. The problem was that he lacked the resources to undertake such an arduous and expensive campaign. Years of struggle and warfare had reduced the Byzantine treasury considerably, and the army was insufficient for such an undertaking. By 1090, Alexios began considering turning to the papacy for help. The papacy and the Byzantines had a long but rocky history. Rome and Constantinople had spent the first 1,000 years of Christianity in and out of communion with each other, the most recent problem being the Schism of 1054. Though the Latin-speaking Christians of the West and the Greek-speaking Christians of the East had their difficulties, Alexios reasoned that the common Christian interest in Jerusalem and the Holy Land would be enough to bridge the gap between East and West, bring about a Christian unity sufficiently powerful to dislodge the Seljuks, and reclaim the Byzantines' lost lands. The emperor therefore hatched a plan to go to the Pope to seek his intercession with the Christian princes of the West, to aid in his struggle against the Seljuks. In March of 1095, ambassadors from Emperor Alexios appeared before Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza in northern Italy. The Byzantine ambassadors explained the plight of the empire and pleaded with Pope Urban to help them secure a band of Western mercenaries to help Alexios drive the Seljuks out of Asia Minor and restore Christian control of the pilgrim routes. Pope Urban was pleased with this gesture of Christian unity and promised to help the Byzantines raise the troops they requested. It is important at this point to note that the Byzantine request was relatively modest. Alexios sought a few thousand mercenaries drawn from the kingdoms of Western Europe to serve under his command in order to push the Seljuks out of Asia Minor. What he got would be something quite different. That fall, Pope Urban traveled north to France to attend the Council of Clermont. The Council of Clermont was a regional synod of bishops summoned to address the issue of reform within the church. Most of this council was concerned with issues such as stopping feuds among the French nobles and preventing simony, the buying and selling of church offices. Indeed, the Council of Clermont would have been a rather routine gathering of bishops had it not been for a speech Pope Urban gave on the final day of the council. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban offered some remarks at the closing of the council, using the opportunity to present Emperor Alexios' request to the bishops of the church. There are different accounts of what the Pope said, but all agree that he highlighted the plight of the Christians in the East and encouraged his hearers to help their Eastern brethren retake the lands overrun by the Seljuks, so that the outrages committed against the Christian people and places might be stopped. The speech was well received by the crowds, who allegedly responded with cries of Deus vult, that is, God wills it. The Pope followed up his comments at Clermont with an official document promulgating the expedition, promising spiritual benefits to those who went east. The campaign was eagerly embraced by several important French nobles, who spent the next 9 months cobbling together an army. People were swept up in a fervor of excitement about the campaign, which took on the characteristic of a popular movement. An army of 10,000 knights and 50,000 foot soldiers was assembled, as well as a horde of non-combatants who wished to go east as pilgrims, for a whole force numbering almost 100,000 people. This massive host was far in excess of the modest request Emperor Alexios had made. Indeed, the Byzantine emperor would later be shocked and alarmed by the size of the crusading army that appeared before the walls of Constantinople in the winter of 1096. But as this video concerns only the background of the Crusades, that's a story for another time. We have seen how the idea of the Crusades developed out of the Byzantine Empire's long struggle with Islam, brought to a head by the savagery of the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century. In their desperation, the Byzantines turned to the West for help, asking the Pope, as the spiritual head of the Latin churches, for his intervention. We must thus see the Crusades as a defensive act of Christendom, not so much a war of conquest as reconquest, undertaken from motives of Christian unity between East and West. Now, whether the Crusades lived up to these ideals is a different question, however. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. What other subjects would you like to see covered on Historia Verax? Let us know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.